We're going to go ahead and cover what is required from sprint number 5. This is our last sprint, and essentially the very first thing that's a requirement is to have documentation that details a backup and recovery plan for this database and the application. Essentially, when you are going to do the backup and recovery of the application, it's essentially going to be the database. Now, this should be including what database backup types are you planning on backing up, what's the schedule frequency, how often, if multiple backup types, when is each one going to occur? Is the backup going to be put on a scheduler as a job? What is the recovery plan in the event of a catastrophic hardware failure, etc.? Those would be things that you would want to provide some details. It's not like you have to write 5 pages on it, but again, you should have at least 1 or 2 paragraphs and nice sizely paragraphs that have a lot of description in trying to detail your backup and recovery plan. The second deliverable is going to be providing a test plan for the application. You have your Woodside University application requirements. That's in the second document that has all the screenshots. And if you look at the video that follows, if you follow this one to the end, it's going to take you through each one of the application screens. You should be able to write a test plan that essentially is going to include the test case ID, test case description, the test case data. So you'll be selecting some data out of the database to actually use as a test condition. And then what would be your expected result? And then have a column for the actual result and the status. Now, if you decide to complete the extra credit around completing the application test plan, then you would have values in your actual result and status, as well as have a link to a video. So that's going to be the test plan that you just document. You don't need to execute on that test plan unless you want to go for the extra credit. Now I have 3 different use cases for extra credit. If you want to try to go for some or all of it, you're more than welcome to do that. For the first extra credit, this is going to be about permissions, and based on the stored procedures that are executed for each of the documented screens. So if you go into the screen documentation, it tells you what particular procedures are actually being utilized, which then kind of refers you back to tables. You should be able to get a good idea whether you need to provide insert, update, or delete activities for each of the tables, and thus would then be able to grant the role permission to the tables or to the procedures themselves, or even the trigger for each of the Woodside instructors, the students, and the administrators. So that's the other. So assume that for each role that you want to provide just the permissions that are necessary. Don't just go through and say, oh, I'm just going to grant insert, update, and delete and execute on everything to the administrators, to the students, to the instructors. Only provide what is needed for the instructors and the students. Obviously, with the administrators, probably everything is going to be provided. So that would be something that you would definitely have differences between the 3 different groups. So that's one option. The second option for extra credit is the takes history archival. So include in your backup and recovery plan about a schedule for archiving data from the takes history into an archive table. It should include when and how frequently this should occur, what should be archived, and the process you would go through to move old data to new archive table and then remove it from the takes history. Maybe a script on a schedule, and in this case you would create a table and that script that you would use to accomplish this. And if you think about it, we can always do insert from select clauses. That would probably be the way that you would get some data to move into that new archive table. And then of course, once it's in that archive table, you could remove it from the actual takes history table. So you want to ensure that that stored procedure process to execute the move is also documented in your backup and recovery, as well as why you would actually want to do an archive process. And then the third option is going to be complete that test plan. And we kind of already talked about how you would go through the test plan. And I've given a little bit of a sample above that essentially is going to give you the test plan. And I essentially filled in one, like I was listening to the video, and essentially that was my test case where I was logging in and it was successful. So I write the fact that that was a successful test case and that it passed. I'm not going to go through, but in your case, most of yours is going to be actual result is going to be empty. The status is going to be empty unless you execute the test plan. And that's where you're going to actively test out all the features that you document in your test plan and then determine whether they fail or whether they pass, and provide some documentation on what that actual result was coming back from the screen. The video should, after you get done testing, just kind of walk through showing that you have your procedures connected to the actual Woodside application. Now, if we look at what is required for submission, you need to submit a Word document. That should be a standalone document that's going to detail the backup recovery for this application and this database that we have created. Then you're going to have the application testing plan. That's going to be in a separate Word document. If you attempt to add extra credit, then depending on what the extra credit option is, you may or may not have additional files. So if you have the permissions, you're going to have a SQL file that's going to define the 3 roles and then also the permissions that are granted to each of those 3 roles. If you take on the takes history archive, you're going to have a table create for the DDL in a SQL file. You're going to have a stored procedure in a SQL file. You're going to have the documentation process that has been added to the backup and recovery document that is above. So that's not a new document, that's just updating that backup and recovery document above. Then complete the test plan. There's no additional deliverable. You're essentially updating that application testing plan and providing the link to the video in that document as well. That should be it for the last project sprint. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we're going to step through the Woodside application. I have a dialog that's asking for the user to log in, and that user is expected to be either a student, an instructor, or an admin. We have our view that is backing our SP check user, stored procedure. When we are going through and trying to set up a test scenario, we would want to go through and potentially set it up where we're finding a user in the table or a student that is going to be somebody that we're logging in as. I would recommend that you try to find a student that actually has classes assigned or grades or something so that we could actually look at some of the data as we're going through. There's a lot of students that have been added that don't necessarily have classes or anything set up, or they have classes and you need to understand when they are scheduled for classes or if they've already gotten grades or whatever in order to understand what you're looking at. So in all cases, when we're creating our applications, we need to know our data, because if we know our data, then we should be able to understand how we can test it. So in our case with our check user, if I was documenting a test plan for this, I would go out to the database, I would find a user and get their email that is a student. I would then have another test scenario that I would go in, get the user for an instructor, get their email and place that into my testing documentation. So test logging in as student, blah, blah, blah. Test logging in as instructor, blah, blah, blah. What happens? Are they able to get in or does it reject them? And then I would also make sure that once I get in, is everything locked down as far as their permissioning? And we'll see what that looks like in just a second. Then I would also go through and figure out some type of an email that doesn't exist in any student or any instructor table. And that would be a test case that you would want to test to make sure that you're getting messaging back saying that that user is not valid. So that would be the test conditions that you would try to set up to test out this particular function. Now we have lots more functions to actually get into. So if I log in and I know that I'm in here, and I hit enter, I can see that I am locked down. I have only instructor permissions and I have file close option available. Now we don't need to necessarily worry about the admin yet. We don't have any admin functions that are available in this sprint. So creating a test case for that would not be able to be executed for this particular sprint. Now if I close out of here, if I try entering something that's not correct as far as an email address, I should see that I'm getting an invalid error address back. If I enter something that is a valid student, I should be able to get in as that student and not see any other options besides the close and then those options that are available through the student menu. Now, if we start going through some of the student features, if we look at the student's transcript, we see that they have taken a class in the spring semester. They currently have a GPA of 4.0 for their class. That was 4 points for the A, 4 points for the credit hours, 16 grade points earned with a GPA of 4.0. Then if we go into the registration piece, because maybe they've decided that they want to go ahead and take a class in the fall semester, they can go through, they can pick the fall semester, they can go ahead and come in here and say the department that they want, specify the date, and in this case, the search is going to bring back classes for that date as well as any of the online classes. And if we go through and say, hey, maybe we want to go ahead and register for CIS-279, we know that they do not have 170, which is a prerequisite. Then if we go through and we should see that we're hitting that prerequisite from our procedure. Once we have done that, let's uncheck that. Let's go through and add the online version of 170. We can go through and add it. Once we have that, if we decide later that we want to unregister because we really don't want to, or maybe we want to take a 102 class because we have that as an outstanding requirement as well, we can add that. But then later we decide we don't want the 102, we can go through and delete that. And now we just have our 170 class. If we go in and take a look at our schedule, then if we take a look at their schedule, maybe the fall, because that's the schedule that they'll be doing in the future, we can go ahead and see that it is an online class and it has a time of NA. Now let's go ahead and close out of this and let's log back in as Josh, who is the instructor for the 170 class. So if I enter his email, go into the instructor options, maybe he wants to take a look at the beginning of the semester at who he has in the class. You can go into the roster for the fall term, look for his 170 class, and I believe he registered for the second session. And we can see that we have 2 students in the class. We want to put them in order by ID or how their last name is. Now, if it's at the end of the semester and he wants to come in and enter grades, or if he wants to come in at the time that we have midterms and essentially he gets to decide whether he's going to drop or have a student remain, he can come into this particular feature. Looks a lot like the roster option. He picks his class and the section, and once we search for that, we see that we have the ability to add or withdraw the student. Now assume that it's midterm and Josh wants to go ahead and withdraw Douglas Grant. He would do that. Notice then he can no longer enter a grade or actually re-enter him back into the class. That would take some other type of administrative type process in order to get that student added back. If he comes back in at the end of the semester, he can go through and give Donald a grade. Maybe his grade is an A. He's an A student. We've already seen that. And we can go through and update that. Again, if we go in, we can see that it has been updated. And of course, If we were doing this in practice, we would also want to go through and make sure that the student was withdrawn, and we have all of the transactional history, like takes history, that is updated as well. If you have any questions about this whole scenario, please feel free to reach out to me.